and she's here to talk to us about the TPPA. Please welcome Amanda.
Thank you very much, Steve. So I'm really excited to be here because being a passionate activist, I always like to tell people about my thing that I'm doing and why we do it. So I was thrilled to come, and I'm really grateful you guys are open and wanting to hear more about the TPPA. Steve gave me or suggested a title for my speech, and he suggested that it is TPP and what it means for New Zealand. But as I was writing the speech, I really thought it ought to be TPP, what it means for New Zealand from an activist's viewpoint. So to be honest, you are going to get the viewpoint from the anti side of TPP, but I'm going to try and make it as balanced as I'm able to. So what is the TPP? Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it started as a P4 agreement, so a little free trade agreement between New Zealand and 4 Pacific nations about 6 or 7 years ago. But it grew and it morphed. America got involved and they began leading the negotiations about 2008. So it's a very different looking agreement now to the little P4 free trade agreement we had 6 or 7 years ago. There's now 12 different nations around the Pacific that are involved in this. So it is 30 chapters, and 5 of those involve trade. Sorry, I've got my notes and I'll just move my speech over. 5 involve trade, and the other 25 involve investment. So it is a huge deal. It is 40% of the world's GDP, and it involves 800 million people. So it's really potentially a good thing to be part of, but we need to look at it closely. The first problem is that the whole 6 or 7 years of negotiations was not only in secret, but in consultation with some of the world's and some of America's largest corporations and some of Wall Street's biggest banks. So this was the first thing that started setting off alarm bells with people that have concerns about it. And none of our elected representatives had access to read the text, let alone contribute to the text like the corporations did. So when people wonder why the activists are feeling suspicious and railroaded, that's the first reason we really object to the process of it. But it has been concluded now. The 12 nations have reached agreement on the 5th of October. The text was released on the 5th of November. It was signed on the 4th of February. It was a lovely day. That was my birthday. It was a big present for me. And we're at the stage now, we're all able to read the 6,000 page legal text, should we wish. And what we're doing is, as a nation, deciding now whether we go ahead and ratify it and become part of this agreement. The government's done a national interest analysis, but it hasn't been independent. And the deadline for submissions for the Select Committee, if you wish to have a say about it, closed on the 11th of March. So it was a really short period of time there. It is moving quite quickly. So what has the government told us about it? It is a high quality 21st century trade agreement that is good for New Zealand. Their figures are that New Zealand will be better off by $2.7 billion by the year 2030. We hear these figures a lot from the government. Okay, so that's the benefit of the TPP, $2.7 billion. What the activists, or what the opponents have done is put this in perspective, and we've said, well, compared to GDP, that's a 0.9% increase in GDP. So it's a very small benefit. the government's own figures say that by 2030, our economy will grow 47% anyway without the TPP, and with the TPP we'll be 47.9% better off. So remember that figure, 0.9%. So, $2.7 billion. Now that's made up of two components. A quarter of that is what we gain from eliminating trade barriers when we want to export our goods to other countries. That's worth about $260 million. So that's about 0.2% of GDP. Most of the benefits that have been claimed by the government come through what's called non-trade barriers. And that is, according to their figures, worth about $1.7 billion. So it's the non-trade barriers that we're removing that is actually bringing all the benefit from the TPPA. So what's a non-trade barrier, and how do they create $1.7 billion out of it? Well, non-trade barriers are government regulations that are deliberately discriminatory and restrict trade. So we need to remove those. But they need to be very carefully distinguished from regulation that is for the public interest. And there's a real grey area there, and this is where a lot of the problems come about. Regulations in the public interest are called non-trade measures. They've got a different name. And they're things such as food labelling, protecting food safety, and environmental measures. So we need to be very careful to get that distinction right. But the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade, MFAT, have told us and they've reassured us that we will be able to regulate in the public interest. The problem with this is that New Zealand's Law Foundation has found some very, very different things as they've gone through the text. And I haven't got much paper in here, I want to. So they've put out this legal expert paper here, and they come up with some different things. They say it is impossible to distinguish between what constitutes a non-trade barrier and a non-trade measure. In fact, in the study commissioned by MFAT itself, the authors acknowledge uncertainties in identifying the non-trade barriers, let alone quantifying them. They've said, we recommend that results from these estimates be viewed with appropriate caution. So that's the expert paper quoting the government's paper, telling us to be careful of their own figures. So there's a definite grey area between genuine regulation in the public interest and legitimate non-trade barriers, and that's a very real concern. So a further point is that the Law Foundation here has also said it is difficult to understand how removal of these undefined non-trade barriers could possibly create $1.7 billion per year. So their paper uses phrases like little confidence, speculative, contested, and unsubstantiated. They also said that the World Bank did a similar study and came up with words like fraught with uncertainty. But my favourite one is this one. There's a research company in Wellington, and their directors have worked for the World Bank, the Reserve Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the Bank for International Settlements. So they're quite distinguished. They did a study as well, and they were so unimpressed they called it garbage in, garbage out. So I thought that was funny, it appealed to me. So moving on, who decides whether the government regulations are for genuine public interest or whether they're a legitimate non-trade barrier? I'm glad you asked, because that's where we get the investment chapter, and I'm sure you've all heard this on the news, that the biggest thing that the opponents are concerned about is the secretive offshore tribunals. Okay, they are court cases that are not through New Zealand's first world, first class judicial system. They are the ISDS provisions, investor, which is a multinational corporation, state, which is New Zealand. So it's a case from a multinational corporation to New Zealand. And these ISDS features lack the characteristics of a credible and independent legal process, so much so that there was an open letter of protest written to the New Zealand government from 100 New Zealand lawyers, jurists and judges who were urging the government to reject these ISDS provisions. They found it completely unethical, is what they said, and the reasons were because these offshore court systems are, well, they're offshore. They are not always in secret, but if they can be in secret. There's no precedent. It's gone flat. Shall I yell? There's no precedent. There is a conflict of interest. So, of the 3 people on the tribunal, the corporate lawyers could be an arbitrator 1 week and the next week go back to their role working for one of these corporations. So there's a complete conflict of interest there. It's a revolving door sort of syndrome. And of course there's no appeals process. So that's why all these first world legal systems that we have in New Zealand are completely unopposed to this. But the government has offered us reassurance on this. They have said to us, the clauses are nothing new. We have these provisions in the free trade agreements we already have, and we've never had a case brought against us ever. Also, they reassure us that Hello? Also, they reassure us that these ISDS provisions are okay because there's safeguards in place. So that's what we've been told. But when you listen to Auckland Law Professor Jane Kelsey, the first problem with this is that the provisions in the TPP are a completely different model to the ones that we have in our current free trade agreements. They're based on a United States model, and she said they're far more aggressive and they have weaker protections in place. So we're not comparing apples for apples, is the first thing. It's also a numbers game. So the TPP exposes us to a huge amount of countries with a huge amount of corporations and their presence in New Zealand. So the numbers automatically go up. But the thing is, many of those corporations are American corporations, who are already have a big presence here, but they are very, very aggressive and very litigious. And they already have a presence here in New Zealand.
What's the matter with it?
It's all right, I'll either yell or keep going.
It's a machine.
Hello. Oh, it's going now. Now I've lost my place. So the American corporations are very aggressive users of these ISDS provisions, and they have some of the most litigious corporations in the world, and they statistically have been the biggest users of them. New Zealand already has, according to Laurie Wallach, 1,608 United States corporations already have a presence in New Zealand. So there's no place for complacency with these ISDS clauses.
Yep,
Australia was complacent. No, it's not going. Right, that's better. Right. Okay. Australia was complacent, and they had a case brought against them by Philip Morris Tobacco, who decided to sue Australia for labelling tobacco. They were complacent before that. Now, Philip Morris didn't win the case, but it costed Australia $50 million to defend. So just bear this sort of thing in mind. Right, they're becoming increasingly, the ISDS clauses are becoming increasingly unpopular all around the world, but the cases that are being brought against governments are increasing all the time. I think there was 50 cases against governments up to the year 2000, and since, well, about now there's 50 a year. So these corporations are really wanting to use their provisions. So I really don't buy this case for complacency. But probably the last point, but really important, is what's called regulatory chill. And I don't know if you've heard of this, but what that means is Parliament might want to pass a law or a regulation, but they might be worried that perhaps a case from one of the corporations might come against them, so they kind of don't pass it, just in case we get sued. Now, that's unquantifiable. We can never measure what public safeguards we're not getting because of what's called regulatory chill. And I would say that's probably the most important part of the whole thing. So, they're the benefits of the TPPA. Now we'll talk about the costs. Right, so MFAT did an overview paper, and in their overview they assured us that the costs will be significantly less than the benefits. Now this is in monetary terms. Now in monetary terms the costs are intellectual property, so that's copyrights and patents being extended and us having to pay more for books and songs, and 55 million a year. Farm Act, 2 million a year. We will lose what we get from tariffs being paid to us from imports coming into the country, $20 million a year. But what we can't measure is potentially the cost of having to pay to defend if we get an ISDS case, or heaven forbid if we lose an ISDS case and we get sued by a corporation. So they're the costs. But the thing about the TPP, and this is one of the biggest costs, it has seriously eroded public trust, not only for all the reasons I've already told you, but trust is a major factor in social well-being. And I think it's very important that we trust what the government's doing and how they're going about it. And I want to read you a quote here from The Economist magazine, who is commenting on the TPP. If you want the public to suspect the worst, give foreign firms a special right to apply to a secretive tribunal of highly paid corporate lawyers for compensation whenever a government passes a law to protect the environment or prevent a nuclear catastrophe. So that's from The Economist. So who is in favour of the TPP? Well, certain organisations are, but obviously including all the exporting sectors that are going to have monetary benefits from having their tariffs reduced. Now I want to remind you that the reduction in tariffs, the worth to the economy we worked out was 0.2% of the GDP. So some of these large corporations, we've got New Zealand Beef and Lamb, their tariffs have reduced, Federated Farmers, Fonterra, well they're a little bit disappointed because with dairy we didn't get all the tariff reductions we really wanted and needed. United States, Canada and Japan are really holding back with removing those tariffs, but there is some gains there. Who else is in favour of it? The Chamber of Commerce, the business councils. They're all in favour of it because there are monetary gains of 0.2% of GDP, and of course the National Party. So who is against the TPP? Well, the people that are against the TPP tend to have different reasons, and their reasons are embedded in a wider view of our society that's less quantifiable and includes things like quality of life, social well-being, health, equality, environment, and also sovereignty and democracy. That's where I sit. So we're not just a bunch of hippies, all right? Now, TV3 Read News Poll did a survey of New Zealanders to find out who was in favour and who wasn't in favour. This was in November last year, and 54% of New Zealanders at that time were opposed to the TPP. 34% of the people of New Zealand were in favour. 12% didn't have a clue because they really didn't understand enough about it. So it was really interesting because of the people that were opposed to the TPP, 23% of those actually claimed themselves in the survey to be National Party voters. So it's not overly popular. There is lists of organisations who have come out opposed to this, and professional bodies, both internationally and nationally. I've talked about the 100 jurists in New Zealand who oppose it. I've talked about a lot of New Zealand economists who oppose it. New Zealand Consumer opposes it. But internationally, it includes a lot of medical organisations, and of particular interest is that all three United States presidential there's more than three presidential candidates. The three key ones that have got the biggest chance. What is it? Clinton, Sanders, and Trump thinks, yeah, they all oppose it, but all for slightly different reasons. Now, I'm a Bernie Sanders fan, and I'd like to quote Bernie Sanders, and I think he's got it right, because he identifies that it's about the power of the corporations as the reason to oppose it. And he says, it's an all-out corporate assault on democracy. Its approval would empower corporations to further hamstring efforts by any member nation to address the potentially terminal environmental, social and economic threats of our time. So that's pretty heavy words there. So there is also, people oppose it, there is a raft of international economists, including Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, who said, another quote, trickle-down economics is a myth. Enriching corporations, as the TPP would not necessarily help those in the middle, let alone those at the bottom. And I'd like to say that since he said that, in fact, the International Monetary Fund has put out a paper that basically shows that trickle-down economics doesn't work. So I'm particularly interested in that sort of area, so I had a read of that. Right, so that brings me on to the rest of the TPPA, which is the investment part of the TPP. And that's the part that affects the economy the most. We will get less restrictions to invest in other countries. So it makes it much easier for corporations to set up offshore. That is through a combination of increasing privatisation and deregulation. So if a new corporation comes here to New Zealand, well, I guess that's a good thing, provided they provide some jobs and they don't sue us and they pay their taxes, which isn't always a given, but that would be a good thing. But conversely, it also makes it easier for New Zealand businesses to go offshore and set up manufacturing in countries with lower wages and less labour laws. And this is exactly what happened in America when they passed the NAFTA. I don't know if you've heard of NAFTA. Huge amount of manufacturing shifted to Mexico, and it caused inequality, it caused unemployment, it caused job uncertainty, and it caused lower wages in America. And this is one of the reasons Americans are so opposed to this. The corporations got richer and productivity increased, but that was because everything was happening lower wages in Mexico. So this is why some people say it's a race to the bottom. Now, as for New Zealand, with this sense, we're not a third world country, so that, what's going to happen here? Well, the Tufts University in America did a study on New Zealand to see how this would affect our jobs and our equality, and they believed it would result in a 5,000 job loss for New Zealand and increasing inequality. Now that was the stage where the Labour Party made the announcement they're finally off the fence, and they'll make an announcement that they're going to officially oppose the TPP. That was the defining moment for them. Right, so the last argument about TPPA is that the government says if we don't join, we're going to be squeezed out of important market access. Well, the opponents say we really don't need it. The gains are very small, we've been through the numbers. The risks are high. We trade with all these 12 countries already, and they're all part of the World Trade Organization. And not only that, we've already got free trade agreements with 6 of them. So, where to from here? What happens now? The government's going ahead, they want to ratify the agreement. But even if it becomes ratified, and they want to ratify it, It won't come into force till early 2018. It's got a two-year period. Now, between then and now, there is an election. And that is our only chance not to be part of this. And I think the whole election should actually be, this should be a major election issue, and I'll give you another reason for that later. But basically, to update you, the parties opposing the TPPA are Labour, although they do say that if they come into power when the TPP is already in place, they're not going to unwind it. But the parties who are seriously against this and will unwind it and don't want it are New Zealand First, Green and Maori. Now, a quote from Jane Kelsey, she's the Auckland University law professor. She said, "After the TPPA has come into force, withdrawal is a technical possibility, but it's a political, diplomatic and economic unreality." So we can theoretically give 6 months notice we want to withdraw from it. The problem is there's a 20-year period where the provisions for the corporations who are here under the TPPA get 20 years where those provisions still apply. So it's not really withdrawn for another 20 years. So if we get back to the election issue, I don't see us voting for the next 3 years. I see us voting for the next 20, because once this comes in place, we really can't get out of those effects for 20 years. And one of the reasons I say that is I'll just remind you about the chilling factor, where future governments might not want to pass laws or regulations in the public interest because they're concerned about the fact that we could be sued later down the track. So that's a 20-year thing. And that's why so many questions are being raised about our sovereignty. Technically, it's anti-constitutional to legislate something that future governments can't repeal, but although they can repeal it, in effect, it's actually still going to be in place for that amount of time. So, why are national MPs not taking a more cautious approach? Well, I think that they genuinely believe it's a good thing. I think they're going by the national interest analysis. That wasn't an independent report. It was done by the government. The opponents, such as our groups, we're calling for a royal commission, which is completely independent. We don't think we're going to get that. I think they're following their leader, John Key. I think they have a lot of trust in him, and they're towing the party line in that sense. John Key believes very much in neoliberal ideology, and this is exactly what the TPP is. I think he really believes it's a good thing. And in terms of geopolitics, I'm guessing, I think it keeps a good relationship with the United States. John Key finds it really important that we're a close ally with the United States. He's actually good friends with Obama and they play golf. But in terms of geopolitics, lastly, I'd just like to tell you one of the things Obama has said about the TPP in one of his speeches is, we can't let countries like China write the rules of the global economy. And a lot of people are speculating that this is really just about America keeping their stronghold on being a major global power. This is all speculation. We're just wondering why there's not more opposition within those circles. So, to summarise, the speech title that Steve gave me was, "What does TPP mean for New Zealand?" And you've got that from an activist's viewpoint. I hope I've shown you that it's very little about trade and a lot about investment. If it's a 21st century agreement, I hope you'll see that the 21st century is going to belong to the corporations. I hope you see that our arguments are not alarmist. We're not breathless children, anti-trade, and we're not politically irrelevant members of society. We're professionals, economists, leaders, middle-class New Zealanders who have legitimate concerns that haven't been addressed. The fight is not over, and I'm hoping you'll join in.